In 1991, a historian and economist named Neil Howe co-coined a word, millennial, and with it, a prediction. Howe believed this generation, born into relative prosperity and arriving at adulthood in the early 2000s, would become the next great civic generation. Educated, collaborative, institution building, a force that would reshape American life the way the greatest generation had before them. He wasn't wrong about their credentials. He was wrong about what those credentials would buy. Here's the number that stops people cold. U.S. millennials hold roughly half the median net worth that baby boomers held at the same age, adjusted for inflation. More degrees, more hours worked, half the wealth. Not a rounding error, a structural outcome. Picture a 34-year-old with a graduate degree, the credential her parents told her was the ticket, writing a $2,400 rent check every month, building zero equity, watching her balance sheet stay completely flat while her landlords climb steadily upward. That's not a personal failure. That's a pattern, and it shows up in the data everywhere you look. Three forces built it: asset inflation that ran ahead of wages, a debt trap that consumed the exact years when savings should have been compounding, and a set of policy choices that quietly rewrote the rules of ownership before most millennials were old enough to vote on any of them. Like a moving walkway running in reverse, you can walk forward your entire career and still end up behind where you started. Howe spent 3 decades saying this was coming. Most people called it demographic pessimism. Then the numbers arrived, and they were worse than he'd forecast. So what actually happened? This is unpriced risk. Everything made sense, right up until it didn't. The millennial wealth gap didn't begin in 2008. It was locked in, or at least the evidence points hard in this direction, by a single Federal Reserve decision made in November 2010, 6 months after the recession had technically ended. To understand what that decision actually did, you have to stand in 2010, not 2024, and see clearly who owned what. The Fed announced it would purchase $600 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds with the stated goal of pushing borrowing costs down and getting money moving through a frozen economy. What it also did, predictably, measurably, was push investors out of safe bonds and into riskier assets. Stocks, real estate, things that go up when cheap money floods in. And they did go up, sharply. The S&P 500 roughly doubled between 2010 and 2013. Here's the problem. The top 10% of U.S. households owned 84% of all stocks in 2010. Millennials, most of them between 14 and 29 that year, held under 3% of total U.S. wealth at that moment. They didn't own the assets that were about to inflate. They were still in school, or just out of it, carrying student debt, renting apartments, doing everything right by the playbook they'd been handed. The rising tide lifted boats they simply hadn't been able to buy yet. And before you reach for the easy explanation that they were spending recklessly, not saving, the data doesn't support it. Median discretionary spending among millennials was actually lower than Gen X at the same age. They weren't blowing it on avocado toast. They were genuinely trying to save. There just wasn't enough margin left after rent and debt repayment for those savings to compound into anything real. It's like trying to fill a bucket while someone slowly widens the hole at the bottom. The effort is real, the result isn't. Howe had a name for this pattern: a generational wealth transfer. Not a theft, not a conspiracy, just the quiet arithmetic of who owned assets before they inflated and who didn't. But the question that still doesn't have a clean answer: the people making that Federal Reserve decision knew exactly what asset inflation does to people who don't own assets yet. So why did the math play out the way it did anyway? 4 years on from that Federal Reserve decision, the economy looked, on paper at least, like it was healing. Unemployment was falling, growth was back. Read the headlines in 2013, and you might have thought the crisis was behind everyone. For millennials entering their late 20s, it was just beginning. Howe had been watching this specific window for years, and in 2012 he wrote with unusual directness that the post-crisis asset inflation wasn't a temporary distortion. It was a permanent repricing event, and millennials were going to arrive at the ownership market just late enough to miss it entirely. Not because they were careless or unprepared. The math was already done before they got there. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis put numbers to it. Economists William Emmons and Lowell Ricketts, both at the Fed's Center for Household Financial Stability, published a 2019 analysis showing that the median millennial household had accumulated roughly 34% less wealth by their early 30s than Gen X had at the same age. The divergence traced back almost precisely to 2012, when asset prices began climbing faster than wages could follow. Their data showed something specific. The gap wasn't about spending habits. Millennial savings rates were comparable to prior generations at the same age. The problem was sequencing. They were saving into the wrong side of a one-way door. Once the price moves through it, that door doesn't open from the outside. The national median home price rose approximately 50% between 2012 and 2019 alone, while millennial wages grew around 12% across the same stretch. Anyone who hadn't bought before 2015 wasn't simply late. They were priced into a different category of person entirely, not a worse decision maker, a different timestamp. And underneath the price gap, a second force was compressing the margin further. Across the cohort, $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loans was suppressing down payment accumulation in real time. Repayment schedules were structured to front-load interest. The early years of payments barely touched the principal. The decade when millennials should have been converting income into equity, they were converting it into interest instead. Howe had seen this coming. What he hadn't fully anticipated was another force pressing down at the same time, one that had nothing to do with interest rates or debt loads, and everything to do with decisions made before most millennials were in grade school. The math that made Marcus Webb's Denver spreadsheet impossible wasn't written in 2013, but to understand where it was written, you need to know about a benefits consultant named Ted Benna. In 1980, Benna found a clause buried in the Revenue Act of 1978, Section 401k, a provision nobody had designed to do what he proposed. He brought the idea to his employer, Johnson Companies. Let employees set aside pre-tax salary into an investment account, a supplement to the pension, not a replacement, a bonus layer on top of a guaranteed floor. He filed the paperwork and thought little more of it. Within a decade, corporations had understood something Benna hadn't. The 401k wasn't a supplement. It was an exit ramp. Shift workers from defined benefit pensions, where the employer guaranteed a fixed monthly check regardless of what markets did, to defined contribution accounts, and you've transferred every unit of investment risk onto the employee. No guaranteed floor. Whatever the market does while you're holding it is your retirement now. Benna later called what he'd created a monster. What he was slower to say was that it didn't become one through carelessness. It became one through deliberate legislative decisions across the 1980s and 1990s, each defensible on its own, all of them pointing the same direction. The mortgage interest deduction, on the books since 1913, had quietly become a subsidy flowing almost entirely to people who already owned property. Renters received nothing. Capital gains on home sales carried preferential rates that rewarded the longer you held an asset, structuring a permanent return advantage for ownership over labor, compounding annually, invisible in any single year. Then zoning. During the exact years millennials were trying to form households, roughly 2010 to 2020, approximately 75% of U.S. residential land was legally restricted to single-family housing. Cities had voted, lot by lot, to make density illegal. Supply couldn't follow demand because local governments had explicitly decided it wouldn't. Then the gig economy reclassified millions of workers as independent contractors. It sounded like flexibility. What it transferred, invisibly, was the employer's half of payroll taxes, Social Security matching, and benefits, directly onto the worker. Disproportionately, millennial workers absorbed that cost every quarter, with no line item showing it. That's what an unpriced risk looks like from the inside. Not a hidden trap, just a named vote whose full cost lands on people who weren't in the room when it passed. What it would actually take to make those rooms change, nobody had run that experiment yet. When the economy locked down in March 2020, something extraordinary happened, and almost nobody described it accurately. Neil Howe had spent years arguing that the generational frame was obscuring something deeper. Then COVID ran the experiment in real time, and the results were hard to misread. Millennial renters and gig workers absorbed the income shock, lost shifts, frozen contracts, savings gone in weeks. Meanwhile, asset markets recovered and kept climbing. The Federal Reserve cut rates to near zero. Capital flooded into stocks and real estate, and by the end of 2021, the top 1% had captured roughly $4 trillion in new wealth in a single year. the largest wealth divergence in recorded American history, which is worth sitting with for a moment. 1 year. What Howe said plainly in his 2023 book, The Fourth Turning is Here, was that the generational frame he'd helped create had become a distraction. Because older millennials who bought homes before 2015 gained wealth at almost exactly the same rate as boomers during the COVID boom. Same generation, same birth years, completely different outcome. The curse wasn't about when you were born. It was about where you stood relative to the asset market when policy broke in your favor, or didn't. That's a harder story to tell than okay boomer or lazy millennials, which is probably why neither conversation ever went anywhere useful. The generational labels gave everyone a tribe to be angry at. What they didn't give anyone was a clear line from cause to consequence. And without that line, the policy window stayed closed, because the people with the most to gain from changing the rules were also the least organized to demand it, dispersed, renting, carrying debt, chronically underrepresented in the rooms where the named votes actually happened. Like an army with no map of the battlefield, they knew something was wrong, but couldn't agree on where to march. That was about to change. Not because of an election, not because of a protest, but because of a number, a census count, that quietly shifted who held the most votes in the country. The 2024 census confirmed what the demographic projections had been pointing toward for years. Millennials are now the largest living adult generation in the United States, the largest voting bloc, by a margin. The generation that was 14 to 29 years old in 2010, too young, too dispersed, politically underweight in every room where the named votes actually happened, now holds more collective votes than any other generation in American history. Howe, in his 2023 book, The Fourth Turning is Here, was careful about what he claimed this meant. He'd spent long enough watching political momentum evaporate to know that holding the votes and using them coherently are different problems entirely. But the policy window, the one that was sealed when this generation was carrying debt into a recession, is structurally open in a way it simply wasn't before. What does the evidence say actually moves the needle? Minneapolis rezoned its entire city in 2019, eliminating single-family only zoning citywide. By 2023, rent growth there was measurably slower than in comparable Midwestern cities that left their codes untouched, not solved, slower. That's what sustained supply expansion looks like in practice, a deceleration, and it only shows up after years, not quarters. What doesn't work is clearer than most people want to admit. One-time payments evaporate into higher asking prices within months. Homebuyer tax credits get absorbed by sellers. The research on this isn't contested. Debt forgiveness without reforming what a degree costs to produce doesn't change the math for the next cohort. The unpriced risk Howe spent 30 years documenting was never hidden. It was in the zoning minutes, the pension legislation, the tax schedules. The votes were public. The full cost was just deferred long enough that the people in the room when they passed didn't have to live with them. Millennials are now large enough to rewrite those rules. They're also, for the first time, old enough to own assets under the current ones. Whether they use that weight to change the architecture or get absorbed into it is in 2026 genuinely open. The case was accurate. What comes next is a different kind of risk entirely. Thanks for watching Unpriced Risk. See you soon.